Someone tried to erase a pharaoh from history, and for thousands of years, they almost succeeded. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was born a princess, became a queen, ruled as regent, and then did something extraordinary. She became king of Egypt, not simply a queen standing behind a young ruler, not merely a royal woman managing the kingdom until a male heir came of age. Hatshepsut took the full identity of the Egyptian king. She wore the royal crown. She was represented with the traditional false beard. She adopted the titles of kingship. She commissioned enormous monuments. She sent ships across the Red Sea toward the distant land of Punt. She raised towering obelisks and built one of the most spectacular temples in ancient Egypt. She wanted her reign to be remembered, and for a time it was. But after her death, something happened to that memory. Her statues were damaged. Her royal names were removed from some monuments. Her images were altered. Inscriptions were changed, and in some places, the evidence of her reign was deliberately obscured. For centuries, Hatshepsut became almost a ghost, a ruler who had once stood at the center of Egyptian power seemed to vanish from the official story. But the stones remembered, the broken statues remembered, the temple remembered, and eventually, thousands of years later, archaeologists began putting the pieces back together. This is the story of Hatshepsut, the queen who became king, and the mysterious campaign that damaged the memory of one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable rulers. To understand why Hatshepsut's story became so unusual, we first have to understand the Egypt into which she was born. Hatshepsut lived during the early part of Egypt's 18th dynasty, during the period we now call the New Kingdom. This was one of the most powerful periods in ancient Egyptian history. Egypt had emerged from earlier political struggles with renewed strength. Its kings commanded armies, controlled valuable resources, and expanded Egyptian influence beyond the Nile Valley. The temples became larger, the royal court became wealthier, the priesthood became more influential, and the pharaoh stood at the center of this world. But the pharaoh was not simply a king in the modern sense. The Egyptian ruler had a religious role that was inseparable from political authority. The king was responsible for maintaining ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, justice, and cosmic order. According to Egyptian belief, the universe had a proper order. The gods had their place. The people had their place. The land had its place, and the king had the responsibility of maintaining that order. This made kingship something sacred. The pharaoh was expected to communicate with the gods, perform rituals, protect Egypt, maintain temples, lead armies, and ensure that the country remained prosperous. And there was a traditional image of what a pharaoh looked like. The king was normally represented as male. He had the idealized body of a powerful ruler. He wore the Nemes headdress. He could wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. He carried symbols of royal authority, and in many images, he wore the ceremonial false beard. This visual language had developed over generations. It communicated something immediately recognizable. This was the king. This was the person who stood between Egypt and the gods. Hatshepsut was born into that world. She was not an outsider who somehow found a path into the royal palace. She was a member of the royal family. Her father was Thutmose I, one of the important kings of the early 18th dynasty. Her mother was Queen Ahmose. Through her parents, Hatshepsut possessed something extremely important in Egyptian politics: royal blood. She grew up surrounded by the rituals, traditions, and expectations of the royal court. She would have understood the importance of kingship from an early age. She would have seen the ceremonies. She would have known the religious tradition. She would have understood the importance of royal ancestry. And eventually, she would become connected directly to the throne. Hatshepsut married Thutmose II. This marriage was politically important because royal marriages helped strengthen the legitimacy of the ruling family. But the reign of Thutmose II did not last long. When he died, Egypt faced a complicated succession. The heir to the throne was a young boy. His name was Thutmose III. He was the son of Thutmose II and a woman named Isis. Because Thutmose III was still a child, Hatshepsut became regent. Her role was, initially, understandable within Egyptian tradition. She would govern on behalf of the young king until he was capable of ruling himself. At this stage, Hatshepsut did not need to become king. She already possessed considerable authority as a royal woman and regent. But over time, her position changed. The woman who had initially governed for the young Thutmose III gradually began adopting the symbols and language of kingship. Her titles became more powerful. Her representations changed. Her relationship with the god Amun became central to her political message. And eventually, she was presented not simply as queen or regent, but as king. This transformation is one of the most fascinating events in ancient Egyptian history, because Hatshepsut did not merely take political power. She entered the symbolic world of male kingship. Her monuments show her wearing the traditional regalia of the pharaoh. She could be represented with the Nemes headdress. She could wear the false beard. She could appear with the body of the idealized Egyptian king. Her inscriptions could use masculine, royal language. Yet she was still Hatshepsut. She was still a woman. The contradiction is fascinating. Modern audiences often look at these statues and ask why Hatshepsut was portrayed as a man, but the question may not be quite right. Egyptian royal art was not designed to provide a realistic portrait of a person's biological appearance in the modern sense. It was a symbolic language. The king was represented according to established conventions. The male body communicated kingship. The beard communicated kingship. The crown communicated kingship. The pose communicated kingship. Hatshepsut was adopting that language because she was claiming the office of king. Her message was not necessarily that she was physically male. Her message was that she was the legitimate ruler. She understood the language of Egyptian kingship, and she used it with remarkable confidence. One of the greatest expressions of that confidence was the temple she built at Deir el-Bahri. Today, the temple remains one of the most spectacular monuments associated with ancient Egypt. It rises against the cliffs of western Thebes. Its terraces stretch across the landscape. Its architecture interacts with the natural rock behind it. Its walls contain inscriptions and reliefs that tell the story of Hatshepsut's reign. This was not a modest project. It was a statement. Hatshepsut was carving her legitimacy into the landscape of Egypt. Every major ruler wanted to be remembered, but Hatshepsut had an additional reason to make her legitimacy visible. Her position was unusual. She had to communicate that her rule was not an accident. It was not temporary. It was not simply the authority of a woman managing the kingdom until a boy became king. She was king, and her monuments repeatedly communicated that idea. One of the most important parts of her temple is the story of her divine birth. The reliefs connect Hatshepsut with the god Amun. The story presents her as divinely chosen. This was not simply a personal religious belief carved into stone. It was political theology. In ancient Egypt, divine legitimacy was fundamental to kingship. If the gods supported a ruler, that ruler had a powerful foundation for authority. Hatshepsut's monuments, therefore, created a complete political message. She belonged to the royal family. She possessed royal blood. She had been chosen by the gods. She was a legitimate king, and she had the ability to provide prosperity for Egypt. Her reign also became associated with major building projects and economic activity. Perhaps the most famous example was the expedition to Punt. Punt was a distant land whose exact location remains debated, although it was somewhere in the region of the southern Red Sea and Horn of Africa. Egyptian ships traveled there and returned with valuable goods. The expedition brought back incense, exotic products, animals, and other materials. At Deir el-Bahri, the expedition was recorded in remarkable reliefs. The images show ships, foreign landscapes, trees, animals, and people. Among the most famous elements are the incense trees brought back from Punt. The expedition demonstrated that Hatshepsut's Egypt was connected to the wider world. It also provided another message. Her reign was prosperous. Her government could organize major expeditions. Her kingdom possessed wealth. The gods were favoring Egypt, and Hatshepsut was the ruler responsible for maintaining that prosperity. Her obelisks communicated another aspect of her power. At Karnak, enormous stones were raised in honor of the gods. Obelisks were not simply decorative monuments. They had religious significance and were associated with the solar cult and divine presence. For Hatshepsut, they were also statements of royal authority. Stone that had been quarried far from Thebes was transported, shaped, and raised into the sky. The scale of these projects tells us something about the resources available to her government. Hatshepsut was not a powerless figure hiding behind the throne. She commanded the resources of a wealthy and organized state. She built, she governed, she commissioned art, she conducted religious ceremonies, she established her legitimacy, and she left behind evidence of an effective reign. This makes what happened after her death even more intriguing. Hatshepsut died after ruling for many years. The exact circumstances of her death are not known to us in complete detail. There is no reliable evidence that she was assassinated. There is no ancient confession telling us that someone murdered her because she had become king. What we know is that after her death, the historical treatment of her memory changed. And that change was not immediate in every place. It developed over time. Some monuments associated with Hatshepsut were damaged. Some statues were smashed. Some images were removed. Some of her royal names were erased. In certain locations, her identity was replaced or obscured. Her memory was being manipulated. But who was responsible? For a long time, the easiest answer was Thutmose III. The story seemed almost too perfect. Hatshepsut had taken the throne. Thutmose III had been pushed aside. Hatshepsut died. Thutmose III became sole ruler. Then he supposedly ordered her monuments destroyed in revenge. It is a dramatic story, but archaeology tells us to be more careful. The destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments was not necessarily one single event carried out immediately after her death. Much of the damage appears to have occurred later in Thutmose III's reign, and not everything associated with Hatshepsut was destroyed. Her temple remained. Her obelisks survived. Many inscriptions remained. Some of her images escaped destruction. The pattern, therefore, appears more complicated than a simple act of personal revenge. There may have been political reasons. There may have been dynastic reasons. There may have been ideological reasons. There may have been concerns about how future generations understood the succession. And there may have been a combination of these factors. The important point is that Hatshepsut's reign had created a complicated historical problem. Thutmose III eventually became a powerful king in his own right. He led military campaigns. He expanded Egyptian influence. He became one of the most important rulers of the new kingdom. But before him, Hatshepsut had ruled Egypt. She had been king. She had built monuments. She had established a powerful royal identity. If later kings wanted the official story of the dynasty to emphasize a direct transition from Thutmose II to Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's reign created an interruption. She could not simply be ignored. Her monuments were everywhere. Her temple stood at Thebes. Her obelisks stood at Karnak. Her inscriptions proclaimed her name. Her statues showed her royal identity. The physical evidence of her reign was impossible to erase completely. So instead, parts of it were attacked, and that is where the mystery becomes darker. Imagine standing in front of an ancient wall. Thousands of years ago, a sculptor carefully carved a royal name into the stone. The name represented a living ruler. The ruler had power. The ruler had wealth. The ruler had armies. The ruler had priests. The ruler had commanded the construction of the monument. Then, years or decades later, another person arrived. They took a hammer and chisel. They struck the stone. The royal face disappeared. The cartouche was damaged. The inscription was altered. The image remained, but the identity had been attacked. The physical act was simple, but the political meaning was enormous. To erase a ruler's name was to interfere with memory. In ancient Egypt, names were deeply important. A person's name was part of their identity. Preserving a name helped preserve a person's existence within the world of memory. This is why the destruction of names and images can feel so powerful to modern observers. Someone was not merely breaking stone. They were changing the story that future generations would see. And for Hatshepsut, the attempt was partially successful. For centuries later, people did not understand the full story of the woman behind these monuments. The temple remained, but its original historical meaning was not always clear. Statues were discovered in fragments. Inscriptions were damaged. Her name was missing from places where historians expected to find it. She became a mystery, a powerful ruler without a clear place in the traditional historical narrative. But history has a strange habit. Sometimes the evidence that was meant to destroy a memory becomes the evidence that eventually restores it. Every damaged inscription raises a question. Why was this name removed? Why was this statue broken? Why does this image appear altered? Why was this monument treated differently from others. The destruction itself became evidence. The scars became clues. And when archaeologists began studying the monuments carefully, Hatshepsut's story began emerging from the ruins. The woman who had been pushed toward the margins of memory began returning to the center. Her temple revealed her ambitions. Her inscriptions revealed her political language. Her statues revealed her transformation from queen to king. Her monuments revealed the enormous resources she controlled, and the damaged sections revealed something else. Someone had wanted to change the way later generations understood her, but they had failed to erase everything. They had failed because Egypt was made of stone, and stone is difficult to silence completely. A name can be chiseled away, but the surrounding inscription may remain. A statue can be smashed, but fragments can be found. A figure can be removed, but the outline of what once existed may still be visible. A king list can be altered, but other monuments can contradict it. This is why Hatshepsut's story is more than a story about an ancient queen. It is a story about power. It is a story about political memory. It is a story about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. And it is a story about the limits of political power. Because the people who damaged Hatshepsut's monuments had enormous authority, but they did not have complete control over the future. They could control the stone they reached. They could change some inscriptions. They could break some statues. But they could not predict the archaeologists who would come thousands of years later. They could not predict that ancient Egyptian writing would eventually be deciphered. They could not predict that scholars would compare inscriptions across temples. They could not predict that fragments would be reconstructed. And they certainly could not predict that Hatshepsut would one day become one of the most famous female rulers of the ancient world. The attempt to damage her memory became part of her legacy. The broken statues became evidence. The missing names became clues. The surviving temple became a monument not only to her reign, but also to the strange battle over how that reign would be remembered. And so, when we look at Hatshepsut today, we are seeing two different stories at once. The first is the story she wanted to tell: a legitimate ruler, a chosen king, a builder, a protector of Egypt, a servant of the gods, a ruler whose kingdom was prosperous. The second story is what happened after her death: a ruler whose images were damaged, a name that was removed from some monuments, a reign that was partially obscured, a memory that was reshaped. Between those two stories lies the mystery. Why did Hatshepsut become king? Why was her rule accepted? Why did she build on such an enormous scale? Why did later rulers damage parts of her legacy? And most importantly, why did they feel the need to change the historical record at all? To answer those questions, we have to go back to the beginning, before the monuments, before the obelisks, before the voyage to Punt, before the damaged statues, before the disappearance. We have to return to the royal household of early New Kingdom Egypt, to the daughter of Thutmose I, to the young princess who would grow up surrounded by the machinery of kingship, a woman who was born close to power, a woman who would marry a king, a woman who would govern for a child, and eventually a woman who would look at the throne of Egypt and do something few women before her had ever done. She would claim it for herself, and that is where the story truly begins. Chapter 2. the woman behind the throne. Before Hatshepsut became one of the most powerful rulers in ancient Egypt, she was simply a royal daughter, growing up inside a world where the throne was already occupied by men. She was born into the royal family during one of the most important periods in Egyptian history, when Egypt was emerging as a powerful new kingdom state, and the rulers of the 18th dynasty were beginning to build the political and military foundations of an empire. Her father was Thutmose I. Her mother was Queen Ahmose, and through them, Hatshepsut belonged to the highest level of Egyptian society. She was not born knowing that one day she would become king. There was no reason, at the beginning of her life, to expect that she would eventually claim the throne herself. The Egyptian monarchy already had its traditions. Kings succeeded kings. Royal women could exercise enormous influence, but the formal position of Pharaoh was normally associated with a male ruler. Hatshepsut's future seemed to be connected to the royal family, but not necessarily to the throne. She would grow up as a princess. She would become a royal wife, and eventually she would become the most powerful woman in Egypt. But the road from princess to king would begin with a family whose future was far from certain. To understand Hatshepsut, we have to understand her father first. Thutmose I was not simply another king in a long line of Egyptian rulers. His reign helped establish the power of the early 18th dynasty. Egypt had recently emerged from a period of political division known as the Second Intermediate Period. The country had been divided between competing powers. Foreign rulers had controlled parts of Egypt. The southern city of Thebes had become the center of resistance. Eventually, Egyptian rulers expelled the Hyksos and reunited the country. The rulers who followed inherited a kingdom that was no longer content simply to defend itself. Egypt began looking outward. Military campaigns moved northward into the Levant. Egyptian armies traveled farther. The royal treasury gained access to new resources. Foreign lands were brought into Egypt's political sphere. The pharaohs of the new kingdom were building something much larger than the Egypt of previous generations. And Thutmose I was one of the rulers who pushed that expansion forward. His military campaigns extended Egyptian influence into the Near East. His armies traveled north. He also campaigned south into Nubia. The king's authority was being projected far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Nile Valley. For a child growing up in his household, the world of kingship would therefore have been impossible to ignore. Hatshepsut would have lived within a palace culture where military victories, religious ceremonies, royal marriages, and divine legitimacy were all connected. The king was not simply a distant figure whose name appeared on monuments. He was the center of the political universe. The royal family lived within that universe, and Hatshepsut belonged to it. Her mother, Ahmose, was an important figure in the royal family. The name Ahmose itself was connected to the dynasty's recent struggle to reunify Egypt. Royal women were not passive figures in Egyptian politics. Their marriages could strengthen dynastic legitimacy. Their relationship to the king could reinforce claims to the throne. Their religious titles could connect the royal household to major temples and priesthoods, and Hatshepsut would inherit this tradition. She was a royal woman in a society where women could own property, manage estates, participate in economic transactions, and hold important religious positions. But being a woman did not mean that becoming pharaoh was ordinary. The distinction is important. Ancient Egypt could provide powerful positions for women, but the institution of kingship remained overwhelmingly male. Hatshepsut's later achievement was therefore unusual, precisely because she did not simply become a powerful woman. She became the king, but that future was still far away. As a young princess, Hatshepsut's life would have been shaped by the expectations of the royal household. She would have been surrounded by servants, officials, priests, scribes, and members of the court. She would have been familiar with religious rituals. She would have seen the way the royal image was constructed. She would have understood that names and titles mattered. She would have learned that a monument was not simply architecture. It was a statement of authority. Every royal statue carried a message. Every inscription told a story. Every temple reinforced the relationship between the ruler and the gods. These lessons would become important later, because when Hatshepsut eventually took the throne, she would use all of these tools. But first, she would enter into a royal marriage. Hatshepsut became the great royal wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. Royal marriages in ancient Egypt could be complicated by modern standards. The purpose was not simply romantic. Dynastic marriages could help maintain royal legitimacy and preserve connections between different branches of the royal family. The king needed a clear connection to the royal line. Hatshepsut provided that connection. Her position as the daughter of Thutmose I and Queen Ahmuzi gave her considerable dynastic importance. Thutmose II, however, did not have a long reign. He eventually died, and his death created a succession problem. The heir was a young boy. Thutmose III was the son of Thutmose II and Isis. His mother was not the great royal wife. Hatshepsut therefore occupied a powerful position within the royal family. She was the widow of the dead king. She was the daughter of a former king. She was the stepmother of the young heir. And she was a senior royal woman with strong dynastic connections. The young Thutmose III could inherit the throne, but he was still a child. Hatshepsut became regent. This was the first major turning point in her story. At first, there was no need for her to become king. She could govern on behalf of Thutmose III. The arrangement allowed the monarchy to continue while the young heir grew older. Hatshepsut could exercise authority without formally replacing him, and the early evidence suggests that this is how the situation initially worked. But power has a way of changing people and institutions. A regent who controls the machinery of government is already in an extraordinary position. She can appoint officials. She can oversee construction. She can manage royal resources. She can participate in religious ceremonies. She can speak in the name of the crown. And Hatshepsut appears to have been highly capable. The people around her mattered as well. One of the most important figures in her eyes was Senenmut. Senenmut was a high-ranking official who became closely associated with Hatshepsut. His exact relationship with her has been debated for generations. Some theories have imagined a romantic relationship between them, but there is no conclusive evidence establishing that they were lovers. What is clear is that Senenmut held important positions during Hatshepsut's reign. He was involved in major building projects. He was connected to the royal household. He served as an important administrator, and his rise demonstrates something significant. Hatshepsut was surrounded by officials who supported and implemented her authority. She did not become king through personal ambition alone. Royal power required an entire administrative system. Scribes had to record decisions, Architects had to build monuments. Priests had to perform rituals. Officials had to administer estates. Workers had to quarry stone. Military officers had to maintain security. Hatshepsut's rise, therefore, tells us something about the Egyptian state itself. The system was capable of accommodating an unusual ruler, and that may be one of the most important facts in the entire story. Hatshepsut was not operating in a political vacuum. She was part of an established institution. She used its traditions. She relied on its officials. She spoke through its religious language. She built within its architectural traditions, and gradually she transformed her position inside it. The evidence suggests that Hatshepsut's transition from regent to king was not instantaneous. It developed over time. At first, she appears alongside Thutmose III. She is represented as a powerful royal woman. Then her titles become increasingly royal. Her imagery begins to adopt elements traditionally associated with the king. Eventually, she is shown fully as king. This gradual transformation is important because it challenges the idea that Hatshepsut simply woke up one morning and declared herself Pharaoh. The reality appears to have been more complicated. Political authority evolved. Her role evolved. Her imagery evolved. And perhaps the people around her also adapted to her changing position. At some point, the young Thutmose III was no longer simply the center of the political story. Hatshepsut had become the dominant figure. She was no longer simply protecting the throne for someone else. She was ruling, and she began making that fact visible. One of the most powerful ways she did this was through language. Ancient Egyptian kings had formal royal names and titles. These names were not casual labels. They were part of the sacred identity of the ruler. Hatshepsut adopted the full royal titulary. She used the language of kingship. She associated herself with the gods. She presented herself as chosen to rule Egypt. This was a remarkable transformation. A woman who had entered political life as a royal wife and regent was now occupying the symbolic position of the pharaoh. But Hatshepsut did something even more interesting. She did not completely abandon her identity as a woman. Her monuments could still contain feminine forms and references. Her historical identity remained female. Yet her official royal imagery could present her as a male king. To modernize, this can appear contradictory, but within Egyptian symbolism, it made sense. The king had a traditional visual identity. Hatshepsut was claiming that identity because she was claiming the office. She needed Egypt to see her as legitimate. And legitimacy was not created simply by saying, "I am king." It had to be demonstrated. It had to be carved into temples. It had to be witnessed by priests. It had to be connected to the gods. It had to be supported by the royal court. And it had to become part of the landscape. This is why Hatshepsut's building program matters so much. Her monuments were political documents. They tell us how she wanted her reign to be understood. At Deir, el-Bahri, she created a monumental complex that connected her to the sacred landscape of Western Thebes. The temple was positioned beneath dramatic cliffs. Its terraces created a powerful visual progression. The architecture connected the human-built structure with the natural mountain behind it. This was not accidental. The landscape itself had religious significance. Hatshepsut was placing her monument in a location where the physical environment reinforced the sacred meaning of her reign. Her temple was connected to the cult of Amun. Amun was one of the most important gods in New Kingdom Egypt. The rise of Thebes had been closely connected with the rise of Amun's religious importance. By associating herself strongly with Amun, Hatshepsut strengthened her legitimacy. She was not simply claiming political power. She was presenting her kingship as part of a divine order. Her temple also contained scenes describing her divine birth. According to the imagery, the god Amun took the form of her father and visited her mother. The resulting child was Hatshepsut. The message was clear. Her kingship had divine approval. The gods had chosen her. This kind of imagery was not unique to Hatshepsut. Egyptian rulers frequently connected themselves with divine ancestry and divine approval. But for Hatshepsut, the message carried particular importance. She was a woman ruling as king. Her legitimacy needed to be explained. Her monuments provided that explanation. They told the people of Egypt that her position was not an accident. She had royal blood. She had divine support. She had the authority to rule, and she had the ability to provide prosperity. This last point became especially important. Hatshepsut's reign was associated with major building projects and international trade. Her expedition to Punt became one of the most famous achievements recorded on her temple. Punt was a distant land known to Egypt for valuable products. The Egyptians sought incense, aromatic resins, exotic animals, and other goods. The expedition required ships, sailors, officials, supplies, and coordination. It was a demonstration of organization and wealth. When the expedition returned, Hatshepsut had the story recorded on the walls of her temple. She wanted future generations to see it. The reliefs showed foreign people, ships, animals, plants, and goods. It was almost like an ancient documentary carved into stone. And behind all of it was a political message. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt was prosperous. Under Hatshepsut, the gods were favorable. Under Hatshepsut, trade flourished. Under Hatshepsut, monumental architecture rose. The ruler was presenting herself as the source and protector of Egypt's prosperity. This was exactly what a successful pharaoh was supposed to do. And this may help explain why Hatshepsut's story is so fascinating. She did not appear to rule as someone desperately trying to survive. She ruled with confidence. She commissioned enormous monuments. She placed her name throughout Egypt. She surrounded herself with officials. She established a strong religious identity. She created a visual language that made her kingship understandable, and she remained in power for many years. The woman who had once been a regent had become a genuine ruler, but there was still another man in the story. Thutmose III. He had not disappeared. He remained part of the royal system, and eventually he would become king in his own right. The relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III has fascinated historians for generations. Was there a conflict between them? Did Thutmose III resent her? Was he deprived of his rightful power? Or did they cooperate within a political system that modern historians sometimes struggle to understand? The surviving evidence does not give us a simple answer. There are indications that Thutmose III held important roles during Hatshepsut's reign. He was not simply locked away in a palace waiting helplessly for her death. He participated in military activities. He held royal authority. His future was being prepared, and that makes the later destruction of Hatshepsut's images even more difficult to interpret. If Thutmose III eventually ordered the destruction, what exactly was his motive? Revenge? Politics? Dynastic concerns? An attempt to control the official memory of the succession? Perhaps several factors were involved. But before we can understand the destruction, we have to understand the scale of Hatshepsut's success. She had done something remarkable. She had taken an institution built around male kingship and entered it successfully. She did not destroy Egyptian tradition. She used Egyptian tradition. She did not reject the gods. She invoked the gods. She did not abandon royal imagery. She mastered it. And she did not rule from the shadows. She carved her authority into stone. That is why the later damage to her legacy is so striking. Because the more we examine Hatshepsut's reign, the less she looks like a temporary figure. She looks like a ruler who intended to be remembered, a ruler who believed that her name belonged among the kings of Egypt, a ruler who understood that monuments could outlive human lives. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the story of her disappearance so powerful. Hatshepsut spent her reign creating memory. Later generations would spend part of their history changing it, but they could never completely remove her, because the evidence of her reign was too large. The temple was too monumental. The inscriptions were too numerous. The architecture was too distinctive. The fragments were too persistent. Her story was buried, but it was never completely gone. And before long, Hatshepsut would make an even more extraordinary transformation. She would move from the woman behind the throne to the ruler standing directly upon it. The queen would become king. And once she did, Egypt would never look at the institution of kingship in quite the same way again. Chapter 3. The Queen Becomes King. The most extraordinary moment in Hatshepsut's life was not the death of her husband, nor the birth of her stepson, nor even her rise as regent. It was the moment when she stopped ruling for a king and began ruling as the king. Somewhere during the early years of her regency, the political world of Egypt began to change. Hatshepsut had entered power as a royal woman, protecting the interests of a child. But gradually, her titles became more powerful. Her images became more royal. Her inscriptions became more assertive. And eventually, the woman who had stood beside the throne began to occupy the throne herself. It was an extraordinary transformation. For generations, Egyptian kings had presented themselves as male rulers chosen by the gods. The king was the son of Ra. The king maintained Ma'at. The king protected Egypt. The king stood between humanity and the divine world. Hatshepsut now claimed that role. But she did not simply announce herself as king and abandon the traditions of Egypt. Instead, she entered the existing system and used its language to make her authority appear legitimate. This was one of the great political achievements of her reign. Hatshepsut understood that power in ancient Egypt was not only about controlling soldiers or possessing wealth. Power had to be recognized. A ruler needed titles. A ruler needed rituals. A ruler needed monuments. A ruler needed the support of priests and officials. And above all, a ruler needed legitimacy. Hatshepsut had to convince Egypt that her unusual position was not a violation of the divine order. She had to show that her kingship belonged within Ma'at, and so she began to construct a new identity. She was still Hatshepsut. She was still a woman. But in the official language of kingship, she became a king. This is why her statues can be so confusing to modern viewers. A statue of Hatshepsut may show a female face combined with the body of an idealized male ruler. Another may show her wearing the Nemes headdress. Another may show her with the ceremonial beard. Inscriptions may use royal masculine language. To modernize, these images can look like a contradiction. But to the Egyptians who encountered them, the message was much clearer. This was the king. Hatshepsut was using the visual language that Egypt already understood. The false beard was not simply a disguise. The broad royal body was not simply an attempt to pretend she was biologically male. These were symbols of kingship. They communicated authority. They communicated permanence. They communicated the role she had chosen to occupy. And Hatshepsut became increasingly comfortable using them. Her royal titulary was particularly important. Every Egyptian king had a collection of names and titles that connected him to the gods, the land, and the royal tradition. These names were not merely personal names. They were statements of identity. They told Egypt who the ruler was. They explained the ruler's relationship with the gods. They connected the king to the sacred history of Egypt. Hatshepsut adopted these royal forms. She used the title of king. She took a throne name. She presented herself as the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. She associated herself with Amun, and gradually her official identity became unmistakable. Hatshepsut was no longer simply the queen who governed during the childhood of Thutmose III. She was king. But why? This is one of the questions historians have debated for generations. There are several possibilities. Perhaps Hatshepsut initially believed that her role as regent needed to continue for longer than expected. Perhaps the political situation made her position increasingly necessary. Perhaps powerful officials supported her because they believed she could provide stability. Perhaps the royal family needed a strong ruler while Thutmose III was still young. Perhaps Hatshepsut discovered that she could govern effectively and decided to make her authority permanent. Or perhaps the transformation was more gradual than any single explanation suggests. Ancient Egyptian political systems were not modern democracies. There was no public election. There was no constitution explaining exactly how a woman could or could not become king. Royal authority was built from tradition, religion, family relationships, military power, wealth, and recognition. Hatshepsut occupied a unique position within that system. She was the daughter of a king. She had been the great royal wife. She was the widow of a king. She was the stepmother of the young heir, and she was already exercising governmental authority. Her claim, therefore, did not come from nowhere. She had a powerful foundation. The challenge was to turn that foundation into a permanent kingship, and that is what her monuments show her doing. Hatshepsut did not hide. She built. One of the greatest expressions of her political identity was the temple at Deir el-Bahri. The site was already associated with royal and religious traditions, but Hatshepsut transformed it into an enormous monument dedicated to her relationship with Amun and to her own royal memory. The architecture was unlike anything most people would have seen before. Terraces climbed toward the cliffs. Columns created long, symmetrical lines. Statues stood along processional routes. Reliefs covered the walls. The temple was designed to impress, and it did more than impress. It told a story. The story began with Hatshepsut's legitimacy. She was not simply a woman who had taken power. She was a ruler chosen by the gods. Her divine birth scenes were central to this message. In the reliefs, Amun appears in the form of her father. The god's relationship with her mother establishes Hatshepsut as divinely connected to the royal line. The message was powerful. If Amun had chosen Hatshepsut, then her kingship was not an accident. It was part of divine intention. This was especially important because Hatshepsut's gender made her position unusual. She needed to explain why a woman was ruling as king. The answer was not simply political. It was theological. The gods had chosen her. The royal family had produced her. The kingdom needed her, and she was fulfilling the role of king. This was a sophisticated form of political communication. Hatshepsut understood that legitimacy could be created through stories. The divine birth narrative was one story. Her monuments were another. Her building projects were another. Her association with Amun was another. And her portrayal as a successful ruler was another. Together, these elements created a powerful image. Hatshepsut was presenting herself as the rightful ruler of Egypt. Her building program became one of the most visible signs of her power. She ordered construction at Thebes. She contributed to the temple complex at Karnak. She erected obelisks. She commissioned statues. She restored older monuments. She expanded temples, and she placed her name throughout the landscape. The obelisks were particularly important. Imagine standing before one of them in ancient Egypt. The stone had come from distant quarries. Workers had shaped it with extraordinary precision. Teams had transported it along the Nile. Then it was raised vertically. The polished surface reflected sunlight. The top was associated with the solar cult, and carved into the stone was the name of Hatshepsut. The message was impossible to miss. She was here. She had ruled. She had built. She had honored the gods, and she expected her name to endure. One of her obelisks at Karnak still survives today. Its survival is remarkable because the later treatment of Hatshepsut was far from uniform. Some monuments were damaged. Some were buried. Some were altered. But not everything was destroyed. That fact becomes important later, because the attempt to obscure Hatshepsut's legacy was incomplete. Her monuments were too numerous. Her building program was too extensive. Her influence had been carved into too many places. But during her lifetime, there was no reason for anyone to think that she would one day become a historical mystery. She was king. She was powerful. She was supported by an administration capable of carrying out enormous projects. And she appears to have ruled successfully. One of the clearest examples of that success was her famous expedition to Punt. Punt was a distant land known to the Egyptians for valuable natural products. The exact location remains debated, but it was likely somewhere in the southern Red Sea region. The journey required considerable planning. Ships had to be constructed. Supplies had to be prepared. Sailors had to be organized. Officials had to coordinate the expedition. The route had to be navigated. And the expedition had to return safely. Hatshepsut had the expedition recorded on the walls of her temple. The reliefs are among the most famous scenes from ancient Egypt. They show Egyptian ships traveling across the sea. They show foreign people. They show animals. They show trees. They show valuable goods. And they show the return of the expedition. The reliefs were not merely a travel record. They were propaganda. They told Egypt that the ruler was successful. The gods had blessed the kingdom. Trade was flourishing. Foreign lands respected Egypt. The royal government was capable of organizing major expeditions. Hatshepsut was providing wealth and prosperity. This was precisely the image that a successful pharaoh wanted to create. She was demonstrating competence. She was demonstrating divine favor. She was demonstrating power. And perhaps most importantly, she was demonstrating stability. This mattered because her kingship was unusual. If a woman was going to occupy the throne, her government had to appear strong. Her kingdom could not appear weak. Her monuments could not appear temporary. Her economy could not appear unstable. Her religious legitimacy could not appear uncertain. Hatshepsut therefore created an image of a prosperous Egypt under a confident ruler, and the evidence suggests that this image was not entirely fictional. Her reign appears to have been a period of major construction and relative stability. The famous military campaigns of later Thutmose III had not yet defined the dynasty's image. Instead, Hatshepsut emphasized building, religion, trade, and prosperity. This difference would later become an important part of the way the two rulers were remembered. Thutmose III became famous as a warrior king. Hatshepsut became famous as a builder. But during Hatshepsut's lifetime, the two were not necessarily enemies. This is one of the most important points to remember. Modern storytelling often turns history into a simple conflict. Hatshepsut versus Thutmose III, stepmother versus stepson, woman versus man. But the evidence does not require such a simple interpretation. Thutmose III remained part of the royal system. He was not erased from existence. He was not permanently removed from succession. He continued to develop his own royal identity, and after Hatshepsut's death, he became sole ruler. The relationship between them, therefore, needs to be understood within the complicated structure of Egyptian kingship. Hatshepsut's rule did not necessarily mean that Thutmose III had no future. He was still the heir. Eventually, he would become king. The question was how his succession would be remembered, and this becomes crucial when we later examine the destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments. But during her lifetime, Hatshepsut had another powerful ally in the world of Egyptian administration. Senenmut. His rise was extraordinary. He came from a non-royal background, but eventually became one of the most important officials connected with Hatshepsut. He held numerous titles. He was involved in construction. He was closely connected to the royal household. He was entrusted with important responsibilities. His tombs contain evidence of his unusual status. His career demonstrates how Hatshepsut's government functioned. She needed administrators who could translate royal ambitions into reality. Someone had to organize the construction of Deir el-Bahri. Someone had to manage labor. Someone had to coordinate materials. Someone had to communicate with priests and officials. Someone had to oversee royal estates. Senenmut was one of the people who occupied that world. His closeness to Hatshepsut has led to endless speculation. Some modern stories portray him as her secret lover, but there is no solid evidence proving such a relationship. What we can say is that he was trusted, and trust was politically valuable. Hatshepsut's reign depended on a network of officials who supported her authority. She could not have built her monuments alone. The temples, ships, statues, obelisks, and administrative systems all required thousands of people. Her reign was therefore not the story of one woman overcoming an entire society by herself. It was the story of a royal institution adapting around an unusual ruler. That distinction matters. Hatshepsut did not rule Egypt against everyone. She ruled through Egypt. She used the existing institutions. She worked with priests. She relied on officials. She used established religious traditions. She presented her kingship using established artistic conventions. She was unusual, but she was not completely outside the system. In fact, one of the most remarkable things about her reign is how successfully she fit herself into that system. The Egyptian state did not collapse because a woman became king. The temples continued functioning. The administration continued functioning. The economy continued functioning. Construction expanded. Religious ceremonies continued. The kingdom remained stable, and Hatshepsut remained in power. This suggests that her kingship was accepted, at least sufficiently, by the institutions that mattered. That does not mean everyone in Egypt celebrated her. We have no way to know what every ordinary Egyptian thought. Most of the surviving evidence comes from monuments commissioned by the royal court. Those monuments naturally present Hatshepsut in a favorable light. But the absence of evidence for widespread rebellion is also significant. Her reign lasted for years. She was able to build enormous monuments. She was able to maintain a functioning government. She was able to send expeditions abroad. She was able to promote her religious identity. She was able to place her name across the country. Whatever the private opinions of individuals may have been, the political system supported her rule, and that makes her later erasure even more intriguing. Because if Hatshepsut's reign had been an obvious failure, destroying her legacy would have been easier to explain. But she appears to have succeeded. She built, she traded, she ruled, she maintained stability. She established herself as a legitimate king. Perhaps the greatest irony is that her success may have made her later memory more complicated. The more successful she became, the more significant her place in the succession became. She was no longer a temporary regent. She was a powerful ruler with a long reign. She had created a distinct royal identity. She had monuments that could not simply disappear, and she had demonstrated that a woman could occupy the office of king. That fact alone could have consequences for the future. Ancient Egyptian kingship was built around tradition. Future rulers inherited not only the throne but also the stories of previous kings. If Hatshepsut remained prominently remembered as a successful female king, her example could potentially complicate future ideas about royal succession. We cannot know whether this was the motive behind the later destruction, but it is one reason historians continue to debate her legacy. Perhaps the destruction was not about Hatshepsut as a person. Perhaps it was about the political meaning of her reign. Perhaps later rulers wanted to restore a simpler dynastic narrative. Perhaps they wanted the royal sequence to appear more conventional. Perhaps the damage was intended to make Hatshepsut's reign less visible to future generations. Or perhaps several motives existed at the same time. Ancient political decisions rarely have only one reason. What we do know is that after Hatshepsut died, the treatment of her memory changed. Her name was removed in some places. Her statues were attacked. Her images were damaged. And the ruler, who had spent decades building a permanent legacy, suddenly became the subject of a campaign of alteration. But that story belongs to another chapter. Before the chisels came, there was a woman who had already won the hardest battle. She had entered the world of kingship. She had made Egypt accept her. She had built monuments that proclaimed her authority. She had connected herself to the gods. She had sent ships to distant lands. She had raised stones toward the heavens. And she had transformed herself from royal woman into Pharaoh. Hatshepsut had become king. And for the time being, Egypt accepted the impossible. The question was not whether she could rule. She had already proven that she could. The question was whether the memory of her rule would survive the people who came after her, because once Hatshepsut was gone, the throne would belong to Thutmose III, and with the death of the woman who had ruled Egypt for so many years, the political story of the 18th dynasty would enter a new and darker chapter. The king who had once been a child would finally rule alone, and somewhere in the years that followed, the chisels would begin to strike. Her face would disappear from stone. Her name would vanish from inscriptions. Her images would be altered, and the woman who had worked so hard to make herself unforgettable would slowly become a mystery. But before the erasure, there was the reign, and before the destruction, there was the achievement. Hatshepsut had not simply survived inside a man's world. She had mastered its language. She had taken its symbols. She had claimed its throne. And she had left behind enough evidence to make one fact impossible to erase completely. Hatshepsut had been king of Egypt. Chapter 4. The Pharaoh Who Built. Hatshepsut did not try to prove that she was king by sitting quietly on a throne. She carved her claim into mountains, temples, obelisks, and the landscape of Egypt itself. For an ancient Egyptian ruler, building was power made visible. A king could win a battle and become famous for a generation. A king could collect wealth and spend it in a lifetime. But a monument could stand for thousands of years. Stone could outlive armies. Stone could outlive dynasties. Stone could outlive the people who ordered it to be carved. And Hatshepsut understood this. During her reign, she became one of the great builders of the new kingdom. Her projects were not simply enormous construction works. They were statements about who she was, why she ruled, what the gods expected of her, and how she wanted future generations to remember her. Nowhere is this more obvious than at Deir el-Bahri. On the western side of ancient Thebes, beneath the cliffs that rise dramatically above the valley, Hatshepsut created a temple unlike anything that had come before it. Today, the monument is one of the most recognizable structures associated with ancient Egypt. Its terraces rise toward the limestone cliffs. Its long colonnades create deep shadows beneath the Egyptian sun. Its enormous scale makes the individual visitor feel small. But thousands of years ago, the temple was more than an architectural masterpiece. It was a statement of royal identity. Hatshepsut was telling Egypt that her reign belonged here. She was telling the gods that she had fulfilled the duties of kingship, and she was telling the future that her name deserved to survive. The location itself was important. The western bank of the Nile at Thebes was closely associated with the realm of the dead. Royal tombs and funerary temples were constructed there. The landscape became part of a sacred geography. Hatshepsut's temple was connected to this world of death, rebirth, and divine kingship, but it was also connected to the temple of Amun at Karnak on the opposite side of the river. The relationship between the two sacred landscapes helped create a larger religious system. During important festivals, the god Amun could be carried in procession from Karnak toward the western bank. Hatshepsut's temple, therefore, existed within a landscape already filled with religious meaning. She was not simply placing a building beneath a beautiful cliff. She was inserting her reign into the sacred geography of Thebes. And that was exactly what a powerful pharaoh was supposed to do. The temple was designed as a series of terraces. Each level created a transition from the open landscape toward the sacred interior. Columns lined the terraces. Statues stood along the approach. Reliefs covered the walls. The architecture created movement. A visitor did not simply walk into the temple. The visitor moved through a carefully constructed experience. The closer they came to the sacred spaces, the more powerful the royal and religious imagery became. The temple therefore functioned almost like a story written in architecture. At the beginning, the visitor encountered Hatshepsut's public image. Further inside came stories of divine legitimacy. There were scenes connected with Amun. There were scenes of religious ritual. There were images of the royal family. And there were scenes celebrating Hatshepsut's achievements. The temple was an argument. It was saying that Hatshepsut belonged in the line of kings. She was not an accident. She was not an illegitimate interruption. She was part of the divine order. One of the most remarkable stories carved into the temple concerns her divine birth. The reliefs present Amun as the divine father of Hatshepsut. The god appears in the form of her earthly father, Thutmose I. He approaches her mother, Ahmose. The resulting child is Hatshepsut. The story presents her birth as something planned by the gods. The political message could hardly be stronger. Hatshepsut was king because the divine world had chosen her. In a society where kingship was deeply religious, this mattered enormously. A modern political leader might appeal to laws, constitutions, elections, or popular support. An Egyptian pharaoh appealed to divine order. The gods were part of the political system. The temple was therefore a place where political legitimacy and religious belief became inseparable. Hatshepsut used that system extremely effectively, but her temple did not only speak about the gods. It also spoke about Egypt's prosperity. One of the most famous sections records the expedition to Punt. The journey to Punt is one of the great episodes of Hatshepsut's reign. Egypt had long traded with regions south and east of the Nile Valley. Punt was especially valuable because it was associated with luxury goods that were important for Egyptian, religious, and royal life. Among the products sought by the Egyptians were incense-producing plants and aromatic resins. These materials were precious because incense played an important role in temple rituals. The smoke rising toward the heavens was part of communication with the divine world. For Hatshepsut, therefore, the expedition to Punt was not simply an economic mission. It was also a religious achievement. Her government was obtaining the materials necessary to honor the gods. and she made sure the story was preserved. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri show Egyptian ships traveling toward Punt. The ships were large enough to carry crews and cargo across the sea. Their curved hulls and tall masts are carefully represented. The sailors and officials are shown interacting with the people of Punt. Foreign rulers and their families appear. Animals are included. Plants are shown. Goods are displayed. The scenes are unusually detailed. They provide modern historians with valuable information about how Egyptians imagined and represented a foreign land. Among the most famous images is the ruler of Punt, often called Ati, accompanied by her husband, Pharaoh. Her appearance is portrayed according to Egyptian artistic conventions. The Egyptians were recording the encounter from their own perspective, and the scene has sometimes attracted modern attention because of the Queen's unusual physical representation. But the larger message is more important. The Egyptians had reached a distant land. They had returned with valuable resources, and Hatshepsut had made it possible. The reliefs, therefore, functioned as royal propaganda. They showed the world of Hatshepsut's reign as prosperous, connected, and divinely supported. The expedition was successful. The goods returned. The gods received their incense. And the king had fulfilled her responsibilities. The story was carved into stone so that it could endure. Hatshepsut understood something that many rulers understood before and after her. People die. Monuments remain. Her name, therefore, appears repeatedly throughout her building program. She was not content with a single monument. She contributed to projects across Egypt. Karnak was particularly important. The great temple complex at Karnak had been growing for centuries. Different pharaohs added new structures, statues, courts, chapels, and obelisks. Hatshepsut became one of the important contributors to this sacred landscape. Her relationship with Amun was central. She wanted her name associated with a god who had become one of the most powerful deities of the new kingdom. Her building projects strengthened that connection. Among her most famous achievements were her obelisks. These enormous stone monuments were quarried from granite, often in the region of Aswan. The process was extraordinary. Workers had to extract huge blocks from the quarry. They had to shape and smooth the stone. They had to transport it toward the Nile. The river then became part of the transportation network. Ships carried the stone north. Eventually it reached the area where the monument would be erected. Then came the most difficult part. The stone had to be raised. Ancient Egyptian engineers did not have modern cranes. They relied on organized labor, ramps, ropes, levers, and carefully planned construction techniques. The ability to erect such a monument demonstrated not only engineering skill but also state organization. Thousands of workers could be mobilized. Food had to be provided. Tools had to be produced. Materials had to be transported. Officials had to coordinate the work. The entire process required an enormous administrative system. When the obelisk finally stood upright, it became a symbol of the king's ability to command resources on a massive scale. Hatshepsut's obelisks, therefore, represented much more than religious devotion. They represented political power. They were proof that her government worked, and they carried her name into the future. One of the inscriptions associated with Hatshepsut's obelisks expresses her desire to be remembered. The exact wording and context must be interpreted carefully, but the general message is unmistakable. She wanted her monuments to endure. She wanted future generations to know that she had built them. This becomes almost haunting when we know what happened later, because some of the people who came after her would attempt to remove her name. The monument she had created to preserve memory would itself become part of a struggle over memory. But during her lifetime, Hatshepsut had no reason to believe that her legacy would be attacked. She had every reason to believe the opposite. Her reign appeared successful. Her monuments were magnificent. Her religious connections were strong. Her administration functioned. Her expeditions brought valuable goods, and Egypt remained powerful. There was another side to her building program as well. Hatshepsut did not only construct new monuments, she also restored older sacred places. The Egyptians placed enormous importance on maintaining temples. A damaged temple could be restored. An abandoned sanctuary could be rebuilt. A sacred place could be renewed. For the king, restoration was a religious duty. By repairing monuments, the ruler demonstrated respect for the gods and for the ancestors. Hatshepsut used this tradition to strengthen her own position. Her reign could be presented as a period of renewal. She was restoring what had been damaged. She was honoring the gods. She was strengthening the temples. She was bringing prosperity to the kingdom. And this fit perfectly with the traditional role of the pharaoh. Her gender may have been unusual, but many of the responsibilities she performed were entirely conventional. That is an important distinction. Hatshepsut did not become powerful by rejecting Egyptian tradition. She became powerful by mastering it. She used traditional religious language. She used traditional royal symbols. She used traditional architecture. She used traditional ideas about divine kingship, and she placed herself at the center of those traditions. This is why the question of whether Hatshepsut was accepted as a woman is sometimes misleading. The Egyptians were not being asked to accept a modern idea of female political leadership. They were being presented with a ruler who occupied the institution of kingship. Hatshepsut's monuments told them that the gods supported her. Her officials implemented her decisions. Her temples celebrated her achievements. Her government continued to function. The institution of kingship remained intact. The ruler simply happened to be a woman. That was unusual, but it was possible. And Hatshepsut demonstrated that possibility for years. Her reign also revealed something about the importance of visual communication in ancient Egypt. Most Egyptians could not read the complex hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into temple walls, but they could see images. They could see the king. They could see the gods. They could see offerings. They could see foreign lands. They could see ships. They could see enemies being defeated. The visual language of the temple communicated even without literacy. Hatshepsut understood this. Her images were carefully constructed. When she was represented as king, she appeared in the traditional royal form. The message was immediate. The ruler was present. The ruler was legitimate. The ruler had the support of the gods. And because the images were carved in stone, they could continue communicating long after the original ceremony had ended. Her temple was, therefore, a permanent political message. Imagine an Egyptian official arriving at Deir el-Bahri during Hatshepsut's lifetime. The official would approach the monumental terraces. The cliffs would rise above the temple. Statues would line the paths. Reliefs would tell the story of the king's divine birth. Scenes would show the expedition to Punt. Inscriptions would proclaim Hatshepsut's titles. everything would reinforce the same idea. This was the reign of Hatshepsut. This was her Egypt. This was the order she claimed to have established. And at the center of it stood a woman wearing the symbols of a king. The scale of this project tells us something about her confidence. Hatshepsut was not ruling as though she expected to disappear tomorrow. She was building for eternity. This is one of the reasons her later erasure is so fascinating. She had anticipated the future. She knew that monuments could preserve memory. She knew that names could survive in stone. She knew that kings were remembered through temples and inscriptions, and she built accordingly. Her monuments were a kind of message to people who had not yet been born. She was speaking across generations. But eventually, someone else would speak back. The people who came after Hatshepsut would inherit her temples. They would inherit her monuments. They would inherit her obelisks. They would inherit the kingdom she had governed. And they would have to decide what place she should occupy in the history of the dynasty. This is where the story begins to turn. Because Hatshepsut's greatest monuments were designed to preserve her memory, yet some of those same monuments would later become targets. The face of a statue could be broken, a royal name could be chiseled away, a figure could be removed, a relief could be recarved, and the question would no longer be how Hatshepsut wanted to be remembered. The question would become how later kings wanted Egypt to remember her. But before we follow that darker story, there is one more achievement that needs to be understood. Hatshepsut's reign was not only about temples and monuments, it was also about the creation of an image of prosperity. The expedition to Punt, the construction projects, the obelisks, and the religious ceremonies all formed part of a larger message. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt was stable. Under Hatshepsut, the temples were functioning. Under Hatshepsut, trade was active. Under Hatshepsut, the gods were being honored. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt was strong. This was the traditional image of a successful pharaoh. And that success may have been one reason her later memory became so complicated. If Hatshepsut had been a weak ruler, perhaps she could simply have been forgotten. But she was not. She had created too much. She had left too many monuments. She had established too strong an identity. She had become too important to erase completely. Her temple still stood. Her obelisks still stood. Her inscriptions still survived in places. Her statues were scattered, but not entirely destroyed. And her story was embedded in the architecture of Thebes. The attempt to remove her therefore required more than simply changing a name. It required changing the story. That is why the damage to Hatshepsut's monuments is so significant. The destruction was not random in every case. Some of the damage targeted the elements that identified her as king. Royal cartouches, faces, images, titles, representations. These were the pieces that connected the monument to Hatshepsut. Removing them weakened the connection. It did not necessarily destroy the building itself. The temple could remain. The architecture could remain. The religious function could remain. But the identity of the ruler could be changed. That distinction is crucial. Someone did not need to destroy Deir el-Bahri completely. They only needed to make it harder for future generations to understand who had built it. And that is exactly the kind of manipulation that makes Hatshepsut's story so powerful. Her monuments survived, but her identity was attacked. The physical world remained, while the historical meaning was altered. For thousands of years, that alteration worked. But eventually, modern archaeology would begin to reverse it. Scholars would discover damaged inscriptions. They would compare names. They would identify royal titles. They would reconstruct fragments. They would recognize patterns. And slowly, the woman behind the monuments would return. But that would take centuries. For now, Hatshepsut remained at the height of her power. Her temple stood beneath the cliffs. Her obelisks rose toward the sky. Her ships had returned from Punt. Her priests honored the gods. Her officials managed the kingdom, and her name was carved into the stone. She had built as though eternity were watching. She had created a monument to a reign she believed deserved to survive. And perhaps, in the end, she was right, because although her memory would later be damaged, the monument itself would survive. The stones would remain. The cliffs would remain. The inscriptions would remain. And eventually, the world would come looking for the ruler whose name had been hidden. Hatshepsut had spent her reign building an eternal legacy. She could not know that the greatest story her monuments would eventually tell would not simply be the story of her success. It would be the story of an attempt to erase that success. And in the next chapter, the image of the king becomes even more complicated. Because to understand why Hatshepsut's legacy became such a problem, we must first understand why she had to look like a king at all. We must enter the world of Egyptian royal imagery. The crowns, the false beard, the royal body, the divine symbols, and the ancient language that transformed a woman into the official image of a king. That is where the story of Hatshepsut's unusual kingship becomes even more fascinating. Hatshepsut's story began with a woman who was never expected to become one of Egypt's greatest rulers. She was born a royal daughter, became a queen, governed as regent, and eventually took the most powerful title in the land. She became king. She built temples that still rise from the desert. She raised obelisks toward the sky. She sent ships to distant lands. She connected her rule with the gods. And she created a legacy that seemed designed to last forever. But after her death, parts of that legacy were damaged and deliberately obscured. Her name was removed from some monuments. Her images were destroyed. Her statues were broken. Her reign was pushed toward the edges of the official memory. For centuries, the full story of Hatshepsut remained hidden. Yet the attempt to erase her was never complete. The stones survived. The inscriptions survived. The fragments survived. And eventually, archaeology brought her story back. Today, Hatshepsut is no longer a forgotten name. She is remembered as one of the most remarkable rulers of ancient Egypt. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. Those who damaged her monuments wanted to control how she would be remembered. But the evidence they left behind helped future generations discover her again. Every missing name became a question. Every broken statue became a clue. Every damaged relief became evidence that someone had once stood there. The erasure itself became part of her story. We may never know exactly why every image of Hatshepsut was destroyed. It may have involved dynastic politics. It may have involved the complicated succession of Thutmose III. It may have reflected discomfort with her unusual kingship. It may have been a combination of political, religious, and dynastic motives. History does not always give us a single answer, but perhaps we do not need one, because the most important fact remains. Hatshepsut ruled. She built. She prospered. She left her mark on Egypt. And thousands of years later, she is still remembered. The chisels could damage the stone. They could remove a name. They could break a face. But they could not erase the woman completely. Hatshepsut disappeared from history for a time. Then history found her again. And perhaps that is the final lesson of her story. Memory can be attacked. Monuments can be broken. Names can be removed. But the past is rarely silent forever. Sometimes it waits beneath the sand. Sometimes it survives in fragments. Sometimes it hides inside a damaged inscription. And sometimes, after thousands of years, a forgotten queen speaks again through the stones she left behind. Her name was Hatshepsut, the queen who became king, the Pharaoh they tried to erase, and the ruler history could never completely forget.